Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Impact of Using Defendable Data to Assess and Budget for the Future. I'm Ann Cosgrove, the Editor-in-Chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar today is presented by R.S. Means from the Gordian Group. Over the next hour, your speakers will discuss how to assess, predict, plan, and execute a successful life cycle cost program for your facilities. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions in the question box in that panel. Please send these questions in at any time during the presentation, and our speakers will address them afterwards. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the panel, so please be sure it's expanded so you can access the question box. And if at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send a message to us also in that question box. Okay, so now let's get started and meet your speakers today. Bill Sloan is an Associate Director of Mechanical and Electrical Services for the Commonwealth of Kentucky's Division of Engineering and Contract Administration. Bill has been with the Commonwealth for 20 years, overseeing the design and construction of state capital projects. Prior to his career with the Commonwealth, Bill was a consulting engineer for the design of building mechanical systems. He earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Kentucky. Chris Anderson is Vice President of Data Strategy and Consulting for R.S. Means from the Gordian Group, and he is responsible for overseeing all data aspects of the construction lifecycle, from conception through build and facility operations, to create a world-class data platform, including predictive analytics. Prior to joining the Gordian Group, Chris was Head of Technology, General Manager for R.S. Means. He has also served as VP of Product for Integrated Broadband Services. And your third speaker today is Philip Ware. He is
Muted.
Engineer Emeritus with the Gordian Group. He holds an MS in Civil Engineering from Villanova University and a BA in Science from the University of Windsor. He is a registered professional engineer in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. As principal
Unmuted.
for R.S. Means, he set up and managed custom cost databases for numerous government agencies and provided seminars and custom training for commercial and government organizations. He has also consulted on the implementation of indefinite delivery order contracts. Phil is an expert witness in appraisal litigation and class action suits involving commercial and residential building products. So without further ado, I will hand it over to your first speaker, Bill Sloan. Welcome, Bill.
My name is Bill Sloan. I'm Associate Director for Mechanical and Electrical Services for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Division of Engineering and Contract Administration. Our agency handles the administration of design and construction of capital construction projects for many of the Kentucky state agencies. I'm also the current president of NASFA, NASFA, National Association for State Facilities Administrators. NASFA is a national organization for all state facilities administrators are eligible to join, and the idea is to facilitate the exchange of information regarding the operation and maintenance and construction of facilities. We have a website, nasfa.net, and you can go to the nasfa.net and get a lot of information on what we do, what kind of programs are available. That's what we're here for, to share ideas and information. Sometimes you find that, well, everybody's in the same boat, and we all face the same problems. And one of the problems that we face in state government or public procurement is we have to balance the available money with what our goals of the project are in public procurement. When we're working with state agencies, we review their budget requests, and I don't know whether most states are like Kentucky, but we have to work backwards from a fixed budget typically. Budget is developed by someone at the agency, gets approved in the budget, and then we have to take that figure and make it work for what they want for the project. And the key to that is you have to have good information to develop that budget. Unfortunately, what we see is sometimes agencies come to us with a budget that they really don't know how it was developed. It may have been something informally on the back of an envelope 8 years ago. It's been in the budget request every time since then and hasn't been funded until now, and then we find ourselves with an out-of-date budget that maybe wasn't all that well prepared to begin with. So the key is getting a chance to review that budget before it's established and make sure it's realistic. And when we have an opportunity to do that, we try to use historical data where we use, if we've done a recent project that's very similar in nature, we'll certainly use published data like R.S. Means, that's available. And then we'll also work with local contractors and suppliers to keep on top of trends. Right now we're seeing bid prices come in higher than we expected, and we have to adjust for that. So any future projects that are under design right now are really having a close look at their budget to make sure we can reflect those trends. Sometimes the agency who comes up with the original budget will question why we think that's inadequate. And we sit down with them and say, okay, here's historically what we've seen, and here's why we think that you need to add 20% to this project, or I'm using that as an example, but we do have to explain to them why we think their numbers are different than ours. The problem comes is once you come up with a solution that exceeds your capital budget, whether or not that's a good idea, becomes moot if you don't have enough money to take care of a scenario that involves more capital expenditure than what you've got. So I think it's very important for states to have audits of their facilities and plan for their deferred maintenance. And having that assessment is a great tool because you can, first of all, you can get a handle on what the magnitude of your problem is. It's probably going to be a little depressing because you're not going to have enough money to take care of everything, but then you can prioritize. One of the examples I can point to in Kentucky is over the last 15 years, we have purchased probably 75 large centrifugal water chillers for air conditioning. And chillers are a little bit like an iceberg. What you see is above the water. That represents a small fraction of the total mass of the iceberg. The bulk of the iceberg is below the water that you don't see. And cost of ownership for something like a chiller, for example, is a lot like the iceberg. There is the visible part, what you pay for the chiller to get it installed, but below the water surface represents maintenance, and over the course of the life of the chiller, that can be many times what the initial purchase price was. So I think the key in using life cycle cost is to think about it ahead of time before the budgets are developed and make sure you have a realistic budget that will give you some latitude to make those kind of decisions. But that was an example of where the life cycle costing did come into the decision making, but you really need good data to apply those numbers. If you know what it costs to maintain a water source heat pump system or a chill water system, a VAV system or whatever, then you can plug those numbers in. And if you have access to those from a third party, for example, that is a good source that you can use for that. So it's a great tool to take your needs and match them up with your money and make sure you spend the money in the most expeditiously responsible method. And that's part of the trick of balancing what's available to what needs to be done. And if you don't have a plan, you can't really make good decisions on where to put that money that you do have allocated. Sometimes things sound like they would be worth it, but when you really run the numbers, it's a real eye-opener that, wow, I didn't realize that we were going to be costing ourselves this much over, say, 20, 25 years, the life of the equipment. And so if you can incorporate things other than the price, using life cycle costing, that's certainly one of the components that goes into it. So just to wrap up a little bit about what we've been talking about, I think it's safe to say that all the states face challenges from budgets. There's never enough money to go around for all the capital needs. And so it's important that you have facilities assessment. It's important that you establish priorities for what you want to do with available money. On the assessment, you need to develop good numbers for your budget for the projects that you are able to fund, and life cycle costing can be an important part of that to make sure that you are good stewards of that money and that you use the money wisely.
My name is Phil Ware, and we're going to be talking about facility assessment, budgeting, and life cycle costing. So we're going to be starting off with a facilities manager's goal, and that is essentially to proactively manage the growing list of maintenance needs. And what are those maintenance needs? Well, we're going to be talking about capital renewal, the replacement of the boiler, the heat exchanger, the preventive maintenance, and repair maintenance. And then somewhat maybe the elephant in the room, or not the elephant in the room, is the deferred maintenance that we might have at our facilities, which includes all of the above. Deferred maintenance can include capital renewal, can include preventive maintenance, and it can include repair maintenance. I've got 3 steps. You could choose your own option, one of which is conduct a facilities condition audit. And I know in the U.S. agencies, many of them are required to, on a periodic basis, do a condition assessment audit, sometimes on a 3 to 5 year basis. Another option might be parametric modeling, and that's one thing we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking about as well. And then the third option to creating this is your own building knowledge, which includes your knowledge of the strengths of your building or the weaknesses of your building. Plus, I'm quite certain that you have a maintenance backlog that you can look at to also give you some idea of what you need to address. So in terms of an assessment, if we talk about a facilities audit, what we want to do is we want to have a thorough understanding of the equipment and the systems in our building or buildings. And that's a very important thing because that's how we're going to then start to establish our budgets. So what happens in terms of doing the facilities audit, we've got to determine what we want to be doing an audit of. And are we going to be just doing buildings? Or are we going to be including grounds, utilities, and equipment? I have to admit, for the most part, I usually see it just the buildings, but of course, if you've got a central plant or something of that nature, you surely might want to get into the utilities. Equipment, depending upon what equipment we have, how critical it is, we might also include that. So in terms of doing the audit, what are we looking for? What do we want to get out of it? And one of them is if we've got numerous buildings at our campus, maybe we want to create a condition index. I don't know how many of you have ever done that. Actually, a condition index is basically telling us the condition of our building, and it is a calculation that is the numerator we have deferred maintenance, the value of deferred maintenance, the cost of it, and in the denominator we have the current replacement value of the building itself. So we might want to do a facility condition index. The other thing we want to do is if we do the audit, we can define regular maintenance requirements. So here we have a list of all the equipment that we've got in the building, so we can define the maintenance required. We also know the contents of the building, so we can define the capital repair and replacements. Another thing we can do is we can then, as a result of that, we can develop cost estimates for the projects, for our deferred maintenance, or if we're putting together a life cycle budgeting program, we can define the preventive maintenance, the maintenance and repair, and the replacement. Finally, it's going to eliminate potentially hazardous conditions. As a result of the audit, we can identify hazardous conditions, and also we can possibly identify some energy conservation measures. The audit process, though, is essentially 3 parts: designing the audit, collecting the data, and then probably the most important aspect of that is the presentation of the findings. So when we talk about designing the audit, as I indicated before, we have to decide, well, gee, what do we want to audit? Do we want to audit just the buildings, or do we want to go on to the grounds and utilities, and what about the equipment? And then the depth of the audit. At the bottom here, you'll see that we talk about a comprehensive audit and a condensed audit. I usually refer to the condensed audit as possibly a white glove type audit, whereas a comprehensive audit is we are potentially going to be going in and, for instance, we've got a panel board. We might pull off the front of the panel board and do an infrared inspection of that panel board to see if we've got any heat building up in our connections. We might also do infrared inspection of a roof or something like that. But depending upon going above the depth of the audit, well, we decide, well, what are the needs? What is the cost of the audit, and what time do we have? So obviously the cost and time might determine whether we're doing a comprehensive audit or a condensed audit. The next thing is selecting the audit team. And we've got three options here in terms of using our in-house staff, an interagency group, or some consultants. But regardless of which path we take, essentially what your audit team is usually composed of about 3 or 4 people. And usually in that audit team, you have a mechanical type person, an electrical type person, and then an architectural / maybe structural type person. Next step, okay, is designing the work plan. What information are we going to collect? Who will collect the information? And a schedule. And probably a schedule is one of the most important things also because, well, you as facilities managers know that there are so many things coming at you that unfortunately with all those things, sometimes one thing has to suffer as a result of another. So to keep us going, we need a schedule. Again, when we start to collect our data, the physical data, are we going to talk about primary systems, secondary systems, service, safety, and then again, whether we're going to go grounds, equipment, and utilities. And then last but not least in this gathering process, we want to do a physical evaluation of the building, a functional performance evaluation, a facility rating. Maybe we are going to use a facilities condition index for our buildings, especially if we've got a number of them. A project cost evaluation, and then finally setting our priorities. Again, this last one, the presentation of findings, is probably one of the most important. And what we're going to be doing here is, in the first step, we're talking about summarizing our building characteristics, how many square feet, what the cooling system, the heating system, electrical requirements, building evaluation. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to be setting priorities. If we've done an assessment, we're going to see things that need to be addressed, and then we're going to have to prioritize them. Looking at the bottom here, the work categories, or actually, as far as I'm concerned, it's priorities: emergency, urgent, routine, or deferred. And then what happens is, again, the most important thing is presenting the findings. You've got to recognize who your audience is. And probably if you're going to present the findings, you might present them in several layers. Obviously, the vice president of facilities or something like that is interested in a very, very detailed thing. The more you move up the ladder in the organization, the person doesn't want to read a 500-page report or maybe a 20-page report. So you've really got to define who your audience is and direct that report to them. So the results of the audit. The results of the audit allows us to estimate the costs of the deficiencies that we've identified. It allows us to estimate the costs of the efficiencies we've identified. But as a result of the audit, we know all of the equipment that we have in the building. We know the characteristics of the building. So we can then go about and we can estimate the preventive maintenance that we should be spending on the building. We knowing the building, we should also be able to estimate the amount of capital replacement that we need for that building. And also as a result of the audit, we can plan for cyclical replacement of the carpet, the painting, things of that nature, and thus actually create a life cycle cost maintenance budget for the building or buildings. And again, this data can be used to calculate a facilities condition index. So in terms of deferred maintenance priorities, this is I'll use the expression, the prioritization structure that I would use. The first one is life safety, legal compliance. What are the new codes that I should be living up to? In the Boston area, there are relatively new standards relative to fire alarm systems, carbon dioxide, things of that nature. Next one is the problem that I've identified resulting in the deterioration to facilities. Or the next one is repairs to prevent deterioration. And the last one, even though I'm not certain, the last one should be energy conservation. But anyway, that would be the potential fifth one. Let's put it this way. The reason why I said it that way is because energy conservation, as far as I'm concerned, is very important. And I hate to necessarily put it at the bottom of the list. Okay, in terms of budgeting, well, we know our equipment, we know what the major characteristics of the building are. So how do we start budgeting? And again, there's a lot of different data. Budgeting can be accomplished using several different options, one of which is the owner's current data. That's always a good option. Maybe recently you've replaced a chiller or you've replaced a boiler in a building. You know how much it costs and you can use that for another building. Vendor information, sure, you can call vendors and find out the cost of different data or different materials or equipment. Of course, the other thing is call contractors in. And the last thing, which is of course my specialty, which happens to be published cost data. Okay, now let's talk about life cycle costing. So what happens is we know we can estimate capital renewal. We know we can estimate preventive maintenance. We know that there's data out there to put together some repair maintenance and cyclical replacements. And now let's talk about life cycle costing. Life cycle costing are based upon the type of structure. Is it an outpatient surgical center or is it a hotel? Also, the type of structure. Is it a wood frame structure? Is it EIFS on concrete block? And then what equipment is located in the building. So what happens is our definition, the definition that I'm going to be using for this presentation is an economic method of evaluating a project's preventive maintenance, repair maintenance, and capital renewal costs. These costs are added annually over the life of a project for a specific time frame. And I wanted to point out that this is not total cost of ownership. All we're talking about here is the building and the components of that building. We're not talking about energy usage and other costs of that nature. So, 4 important questions. What is the annual preventive maintenance cost for our building? What is the cost of capital improvements? Now, mind you, capital improvements are not necessarily something that are going to occur annually. You're going to replace a boiler every 30 years. You're going to replace a roof every 25 years. You might replace a hot water heater every 15 years. There are some years when you might not have any capital improvements. However, there are some years when you might take a real hit in having to replace a heat exchanger or something of that nature. And then what is the cost of repair, maintenance / cyclical replacement? And maybe what you want to do is what is the facilities condition index of the building? What happens is the facilities condition index of the building, it allows you to do 2 things. It allows you to compare building A with building B with building C. But the other thing it allows you to do is if you do this on a periodic basis, you can say, well, I've got building A, and in year 2015, I had a facilities condition index of 0.15. 0.15 is reasonably high. That's saying that 15% of the replacement value of the building is tied up in deferred maintenance. But maybe what you're going to want to do is say, okay, in 2015, I have a 0.15, but what I want to do is by the time I get to the year 2020, I want to have that facilities condition index, if I'm going to be doing another audit or even a white glove audit, down to something like 0.10 or 0.12. In other words, I want to be pecking away at that deferred maintenance.
Hi, thank you for joining us. My name's Chris Anderson. I'm the Vice President of Data Strategy and Consulting at RS Means from the Gordian Group. I'd like to thank Phil Ware for his outline there of facilities management. I've been asked to run through our new online version of lifecycle costing. This is a very powerful tool for facility managers. It allows you to take one of our square foot models of a building and be able to understand in great detail the work involved in doing facility work across that building's life cycle. So to show you an example on the screen now, we've selected a building type. In this case, it's an office building of 11 to 20 stories in height. It has a brick face and concrete block backup. You can select anything from our 100 plus models and a number of different types of framing and other different parameters that can be selected. Additionally, you can then add in locations, sizing, etc. that allows you to tailor these models to your specific building types. And you can see from there the build cost of that building, and then you can calculate the facility maintenance and repair costs over its life cycle. So as we move along, you can see here when we take that building and we run it through our life cycle cost estimator, it allows you to see the various types of facility maintenance and repair work that will be undertaken. This is from our standardized library against those building types. They can be customized to your individual buildings and individual configuration of the items within that building. You can then use this to understand and complete your budget in terms of maintenance and repair and preventative maintenance tasks over time. If we look at the next slide here, you can see by year the costs that will be used in preventative maintenance as well as maintenance and repair to understand the total annualized budget for that individual building. This will allow you to use this on a case-by-case basis to complete a costing for your entire portfolio of buildings. You can then pull together a summary table of all of those costs and be able to see in a graphical form your costs over years. This is critical for helping you understand where you have large jumps in your budgeting and be able to justify those budget changes to the committees in your various facilities to be able to understand why you have large changes some years and exactly have detailed analytical data to back up those changes in the cost. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. As you can see on the screen, there's a URL for you to go to for a full demonstration of lifecycle costing. I will be available to answer any questions that you may have during our live Q&A session.
Now we're going to move into the question and answer section of the webinar. And my name is Nicole Benke. I work with the Gordian Group and will be facilitating this portion of the live webinar. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and submit your questions, and we'll get our speakers to answer those. Again, if you see on the screen, if you want a more detailed demo than what Chris Anderson went through today, which was a very broad-based top-level demo, we have a special free website that you can go to check this out. The web address is info.rsmeans.com/NASFA-webinar.html. And there's also some resources on there as far as giving you the ability to download a case study that we did with the Department of Energy, as well as checking out a video that we produced in-house on life cycle costing. So I would encourage you to check that out. We're going to move on to our first question that we've received from the audience. Bill, this looks like this should be directed to you. How can we get buy-in from upper management to give us the resources to use published data?
Well, I think there's a very high cost. If you have a project that misses a budget, you go to bid and the bids come in more than your budget. You can't go to construction. There's a very high cost both with money and time lost in the project. If you have to go back and cut things out of the budget or lose time to redesign or whatever it takes to get back to something that you can actually build, you want to avoid that. So I think if you can verify, use published data for verification during the design process at the various stages, that's going to help keep you out of that situation. Also, again, as we talked about earlier, developing the budgets, that's a good tool for that. And the published data also can help you with your project data if you have to defend them, if you're questioned, or if somebody else feels that you're maybe being too conservative. That's a good tool to help you defend that and make sure those numbers are accurate.
Thank you, Bill. Again, that was Bill Sloan. He is the current president of NASFA and also works with the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Our next question is, I believe, directed at Phil. The question is, does life cycle costing help you better plan for emergencies or unexpected events?
Oh, yes. Well, that's a decent question. I think my first thing is you really don't plan for emergencies or unexpected events. They somewhat just happen. But in terms of the life cycle costing, when we were talking about budgeting, doing our life cycle costing budgeting, if you recall, we were talking about doing preventive maintenance on our equipment. We were talking about doing capital renewals on our equipment. And the result of both the preventive maintenance and the capital renewal should essentially really cut down on any potential emergencies or unexpected events, particularly as the preventive maintenance. That's what preventive maintenance is all about. We want to see that that if there's a belt that's going, if there's a compressor that's going, whatever it is, that we essentially repair it before it goes, and thus we do not have any emergencies or unexpected events. So I guess the answer to that is if we are budgeting properly for life cycle maintenance, if you will, there should be very few unexpected events or emergencies. And actually, then obviously, if we've got fewer emergencies and unexpected events, that cuts down on the cost of maintenance, because all of us know that emergencies cost a heck of a lot more than fixing things before the emergency occurs. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Phil. Our next question, Phil, you may be able to take this one as well, or perhaps Chris Anderson. This audience member would like to know that we have not done a facility assessment in years and not sure if we have the resources or time to truly conduct one. How can we get back on track and start using life cycle costing?
Okay, I guess there was one good point that was made there, that there was a facilities assessment done at some time. And that's encouraging because as a result of that, ideally the facility has a list of all the major equipment in the building, the major systems. So you've got a good starting point there. Probably the way to start getting back on track is to look at that equipment that you've got and say, well, over the course of time, or since you've done the audit, what major pieces of equipment have been replaced? Possibly you've got let's for the sake of discussion say you've got a boiler and the building's 50 years old, and you did your audit 25 years ago or something of that nature, or 20 years ago. But when you look at your records, you realize that boiler has been replaced 15 years ago. So what you could do is you can then determine, well, gee, if boiler was put in 15 years ago and I have a 25 or 30-year life cycle for that boiler, I know when I have to replace it. And essentially really what it is just making certain, using the whatever audit information that you have, updating it as much as you can from your records in terms of replacements of chillers, boilers, whatever, and then applying, if you will, the data that Chris Anderson was showing you in order to then produce a life cycle maintenance budget.
Perfect. Our next question, will you talk more about the FCI and what goes into the calculation? Does RS Means calculate this for you?
Okay, the Facility Condition Index, what goes into the calculation is, first of all, is your deferred maintenance. So what you want to do is you want to, as a result of either your current records or ideally an assessment, you can look at what of the total cost of your deferred maintenance. You say, well, how do we calculate that? Again, you can calculate it from your own current records or using RS Means data or some other thing. So what you're going to do is you're going to add up the entire cost of the deferred maintenance that you've identified. So that's the numerator. The denominator is essentially the replacement cost of the building. And the easiest and best way to calculate the replacement cost of the building is to go into, again, the model that Chris Anderson demonstrated and putting in the parameters of that building. And that model will give you the current replacement cost, or that program will give you the current replacement cost today of that building. So, and again, that model can be manipulated to, as closely as possible, reflect what your building is, the number of square feet of perimeter of the building, the story height, different wall construction, different structural members, such as steel versus reinforced concrete. So, again, the Facility Condition Index is the total cost of deferred maintenance, the calculated however you wish, possibly using means data, divided by the current replacement cost of the building, and again, that can be determined from means cost models.
Great. Phil, it looks like you're on fire. You are definitely in the hot seat again with another question for you, so take it all in. So, shouldn't the facility audit stand alone in terms of any audience, providing the level of detail for the high-level executive as well as for the facility managers, the facility management staff? Shouldn't it be both detailed and at a summary level for the big picture? And I can reread
I'm sorry,
that.
would you just repeat that question
Yes,
again? I'm not certain.
absolutely. I kind of fumbled over that. Shouldn't the facility audit stand alone in terms of any audience, providing the level of detail for the high-level executives as well as for the FM staff? Shouldn't it both be detailed at a summary level and for the big picture?
Oh yes, I totally agree that yes, it should stand alone. I guess what I was thinking of is that there's definitely got to be an executive summary, I guess would be my expression, or maybe a couple layers of executive summary. I don't think I was saying that the president of the company shouldn't receive the entire package, but I don't really think the president of the company or the organization is really that interested in the nitty-gritty. So I think that probably what I would say is that the audit stands alone, but interior or in the presentation of the audit, you have several layers of description so that the person, the facilities people can go into the very granular aspect, and the executive can read the executive summary or the next layer down to better understand what the audit has revealed.
All right. And for the audience, sorry, this is going to be our last question. I know that it's been enjoyable listening to Phil answer all the questions today, and he's available for autographs after this. But our very last question is, what's the best way to incorporate more factors like energy efficiency into a life cycle cost analysis?
Oh, that energy efficiency into life cycle cost analysis. I think that's going to go a little bit more into what Bill was talking about, where you are going to end up really doing the more traditional version, if you will, of life cycle cost analysis, which does include both energy considerations and what am I looking for? Energy considerations and even the cost of disposal of the equipment at the very end. In terms of producing it in the life cycle cost, from my perspective, I guess what you would have to do is take your major equipment and do I'll use the expression, the traditional life cycle cost analysis, which includes the initial cost of the equipment, the operating cost, the disposal cost, and apply that to each of the individual elements, and then come up with a total dollars there. But what happens is you want to be comparing equipment also to find out which is the most energy efficient. So this is a multi-layered analysis that you want to get into, and I'm not certain. Unfortunately, I'm not certain that there's a quick answer to this. I would really have to play around with different methodologies in order to do the life cycle cost, which includes energy. One of the things that we've struggled with is when we think about it, and Means has considered this, is that there are energy costs vary so much across the country that in terms of and also by organization depending upon usage, that it's very difficult to create a universal model that models energy usage or total cost of ownership. So I guess the long and short of it is that it's going to be a multi-layered analysis, and that that would take a lot of planning and analysis in order to do it. And unfortunately, I personally have not done it at this stage.
Not a problem. Actually, I know that Bill Sloan has actually done some methods using that type of life cycle costing. Bill, is there anything you want to add on that?
Well, I guess the example I talked about with the chillers, we actually use the manufacturers. We develop a small spreadsheet that has several predetermined load points and number of hours that the chiller is projected to operate at that load point. The manufacturer plugs in a efficiency number, kilowatts per ton, and then that number is carried out and it's corrected for present value, and that becomes part of the bid price. It can get a little more complicated than that if you want it to be, but I think you have to keep it something you can get your arms around. That's you don't have too many unknowns that you have to guess at. That seemed to be a good compromise for us. It's not a rigid analysis, but it's better than guessing at which one's the better deal, and we think it served us pretty well.
Thank you. We have experienced a little bit of technical difficulty in that Chris Anderson is having some problems on his end. Chris, didn't know if you were able to fix that and if you had anything you wanted to add as we close up.
Can you hear me, Nicole?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. I would just like to recommend that people go to the link that we mentioned earlier, and they can have a good look at the life cycle costing facility. There's a 30-minute webinar on there in its own right to help people have a greater in-depth understanding of what we're offering with that product. I think that would be very informative, certainly for some of the people who are asking these questions. And please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen there, and I'd be more than happy to answer any more detailed questions outside of this webinar.
All right, great. Thank you again to Bill, Phil, and Chris for being our speakers today, and thank all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. We are recording this, and we'll be sending a copy of the recording as well as the slides out later in the week. In the meantime, again, visit rsmeans.com/nasfa.webinar.html. And again, contact Chris if you have any questions. Thanks again, and have a great week.